Hi, it's Professor Olson coming to you almost live again. Chapter 8, European Civilization, the Early Middle Ages, the year 750 to 1000 AD or CE, depending on which dating scheme you prefer. If you recall, I mentioned earlier how we get the word, the term Middle Ages because of the Renaissance historians as history became a discipline in its own right. People were chronicling events, but nobody had thought of history as a discipline until that period. But let's review. We looked at chapter 7, we looked at the shift, we looked at late antiquity, we looked at the shift as Rome breaks in half and as the West begins to falter and loses its Romanness. And even in the East, while they continue as the last gasp of the Roman Empire, they too are losing some of their Romanness and they're becoming increasingly Greek. When we look at Europe, which of course was impacted by the decline of the West, if you remember, we spoke about the Teutoburg Forest. We looked at how the forest prevented the Roman legions from getting into what was at the time Germania, what will later become modern Germany, the Teutoburg Forest Massacre, for example. So that geography hasn't changed. That terrain hasn't changed. So when we look at Europe at this point, it's still fairly sparsely populated. Not a lot of land is being cultivated because it's hard to clear the forests. And of course, forests are dense and not a lot of sunlight is getting in. And of course, the soil is a lot of clay and it's keeping the plows from really functioning. It's sticky, it's holding them back. So, and if all you have are hand tools, clearing a forest is really difficult. So land was not well cultivated for quite some time. All right, so when we look at the percentage of land being cultivated, we estimate at this point it's about 5 to 10%. So less than 10% of the land is being cultivated because it's not usable in this manner. All right, so the people who are there, it's a small population, all right, and they're living in a limited agricultural economy. They're living pretty much like our early Roman and Greek farmers were, more of a subsistence agricultural economy. They're growing enough to feed themselves, maybe some surplus left over. And a lot of them are, of course, worried about invasion by, warlords and a lot of changing of hands of power during this time. A number of these groups rallied around people who could protect them. This is going to be the beginning of what we'll later see to be the knight culture. So right now, people are pretty much living, surviving, but they're not thriving. All right. Low yields, weather was colder at the time, so you weren't getting a lot of surplus. Land was limited because obviously you had to stay within the temperate zone. So land that might have otherwise been cultivated was lying fallow, that is unused. All right. So unfortunately, at this point, our population is falling because they're not being well fed. They're not being well cared for because they cannot grow what they need. And there's a lot of children who don't live past their first year. High infant mortality rate. And a lot of children, of course, did not make it to adulthood. And those that did might even be scarred from, what they had to endure to become adults. All right. By the time the dust settles, if you will, by the time people begin to form communities, they have protectors, we're looking at what will become France and Germany. Remember the Franks when we spoke last time? All right. We finally see a new culture emerge, and the culture will emerge under Charlemagne, or Carolus Magnus, which is Charles the Great. So Charlemagne literally means Charles the Great. Charles Martel, who you might recall from our last session, had been an official of the palace. He had led the Franks to victory against the Moors, which is what they called the Muslims. And when he dies, He leaves the kingdom to Pepin the Short, and then Pepin leaves it to Charles the Great. I'm not so worried about too many of the dates. The only one I'm going to ask you to remember is the year 800, which we'll talk about momentarily. All right. So Charlemagne expands the kingdom. It's not the same height of land as it was during Rome, but he brings in culture. He brings in stability. He brings in what we will later call the Carolingian Renaissance. There will be gains in art, gains in learning, gains in culture. All right. And in 800, a significant year, the Pope crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans. All right. In part to solidify the relationship the two men had formed in terms of, helping Europe to regain some civility, if you will. But also, this is significant for several reasons. First, it sets a precedent. From now on, the Pope will be crowning many of the kings of Europe and the emperors of Europe. In fact, this is why when Napoleon declares himself emperor after the French Revolution, ushering in the Napoleonic era, and he puts the crown on his own head, it was a big political statement. But normally, until Napoleon, popes began to crown the kings. And we get this view of the world. The medieval view of the world is God, the Pope, kings, everybody else. All right. So it was seen that the Pope was God's representative on earth, and therefore he had power even over kings. All right. Now, he crowns him Emperor of the Romans, and he establishes what will be called the Holy Roman Empire. To paraphrase from Saturday Night Live many, many years ago, it is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. First off, are the Romans really the Romans anymore? And of course, we know the answer is no. They've intermarried with the Germanic invaders. They've become Germanized. Romans are no longer a political entity even. So it's not ancient Rome in the Roman sense. There's a Roman culture that's been taken over and disseminated throughout this period by these, by these people and, their ancestors. But it's not truly Roman. Holy, Charlemagne isn't a churchman. Empire, well, it's the biggest thing out there, but it's still not as big as the Roman Empire. But for all intents and purposes at this moment, it is the biggest empire there is. All right. So this is a really important moment. So please remember 800, Christmas Day, 800, which is when the Pope crowned Charlemagne. All right. And this new Holy Roman Empire is a fusion. Like so many of the other things we've seen, Hellenistic culture, for example, it is a fusion. There's Roman roots, there's Germanic roots, and of course, now that Christianity has become an official state religion, it's become widely disseminated, it is also part of this Christian culture now that has permeated Europe. All right. And the Carolingian Renaissance was, for the people who were there, a major, major step forward. All right. Carolingian Renaissance. We have the Carolingian hand. They start to standardize their alphabet so that they can write documents faster. They become more of an administrative center. Think back to the Persian Empire, the Hellenistic empires, and administration was a big part of making empire and government work. All right, so we see an increase in administration during the Carolingian Renaissance. Therefore, they need this new alphabet, this hand, the Carolingian hand, in order to create documents. All right. It was focused on Christian learning, Christian writings, correcting the Old and the New Testaments, making sure they were faithful to the source material, founding of universities to promote the liberal arts. Of course, theology, the study of God and scripture, would become the, quote, queen of the sciences during this period. But now we see learning is valued. They have the ability to be at peace, to have learning. They have different poets and writers come in Alcuin, who also helped to pioneer medieval learning, was also a poet who was invited to the court. And a lot of how they became more Roman is they looked to Italy. They looked to what was going on in Italy to keep classical heritage alive. It's not exact, it's not perfect, but they are incorporating it where possible into their daily lives. All right. And because of the church and the church being involved, the church begins to influence culture as well. You remember I mentioned that fusion? Monogamy. You should have, according to their teachings, one spouse. You should be faithful. Marriage, it used to be divorces were in some ways, depending on culture, easier to get, but of course usually instituted by the male, not the female. And now marriage was considered unbreakable, indissoluble. You could not simply get a divorce. Basically, it was indeed until death do you part. Because in the old days, so many people had brought in extended family members, their people's grandparents, their parents, their cousins, their nephews, their nieces, because it was seen you were responsible for all of these different people. If you think back to the Roman paterfamilias and the importance of family and clan, now because marriage was seen as the man and the wife and their immediate children, the so-called nuclear family, what we're more familiar with today, begins to replace these extended households. All right. And this impacts the culture as well. All right. So now the nuclear family will replace the extended family. All right. And Christianity is still evolving at this point. All right. Monasteries take in unwanted children because before this, people were more likely to be having sex outside of marriage. The monks would take in these unwanted children, provide for them, find homes, teach them trades. And now they also provide lodging for travelers. The roads are becoming safer again. People are beginning to travel. All right. Unfortunately, while all this learning and culture is going on, there's still some issues with people having what they need to survive. Bread, cheese, meat, and lots of alcohol, because water still isn't going to be really potable in a lot of places without doing the old Roman practice of putting in a few drops of vinegar or wine. So watered wine became very common. All right, so people are still having malnutrition. They're still not always getting everything they need. And the medicine is blending classical texts such as Galen, Hippocrates, with traditional herbal remedies. Even today, if you take an aspirin, you've basically just taken salicylic acid, which comes from a willow tree. So a lot of early people would drink willow tea if they had a headache or pain. Digitalis, which is used as a heart medication, comes from foxglove, which is an herb, a plant you could go out and find. It was used for a variety of purposes. So, but in addition to these, we also see a lot of charms, a lot of superstition. People who would go to church could easily believe in the Irish fairies and brownies. Fairies were terrible creatures. They were tall as men. They were not little sprites like we think today. And they would play games on people and trick them. And the brownies, supposedly, if you put out a saucer of milk, they would clean your house and do other things to help you out. So all of these little superstitions exist side by side with church teaching. All right. People believed in magical rites. If you said certain things or did certain things, if you wore a charm, maybe you would get lucky, with something you were worried about, or maybe it would ward off the so-called evil eye if you were in Italy. So all of these different little superstitious things existed side by side with the Christian church. All right. A lot of pagan practices went on. Now, having said all this, of course, for a while these existed side by side. Later, they would be frowned upon. and start to be eradicated in so-called witch crazes, which we'll get to when we get to that chapter. All right. And of course, after Charlemagne dies, much like a lot of the Hellenistic rulers and the Roman generals slash emperors who had force of personality and charisma, Charlemagne lived a very long time. He ruled for 40 years. In a world where people were lucky to hit 48, 50 years old, he lived to be almost 70, I think it was, or 75. He was long-lived for his time. And because he had such a long reign, it really helped to keep things stable. But unfortunately, once he dies, his sons are arguing over who should get what, and his grandsons are arguing over who should get what. So the Treaty of Verdun would split Charlemagne's kingdom, which, remember, at the time was the biggest political entity at the moment, into several different regions. It splits the Carolingian Empire. All right, Charles the Bold gets what will later become France. Gotta love these names. Louis the German gets what will later become Germany, and Lothar gets the land between the two of them, the Rhineland. All right, so now the kingdom is divided. And now more and more conflicts begin to emerge. The Muslims will go into Italy, Sicily, and Spain. Remember, I mentioned the Al-Andalus Peninsula and how they were going into the Al-Andalus region of Spain back in 711. All right, now they've established a foothold in Spain. They're creeping up, they're creeping up, they're creeping up. And in the meantime, now they're looking at Italy and Sicily and saying, oh, wow, we want to go there. And of course, they still want that rich prize of Constantinople. So now the Muslims begin to make more and more raids upon European territory. They want to get another foothold into this. And Sicily will become, for them, for a while, the most successful of the areas that they try to raid. Kind of like the Vikings. The Vikings spent a lot of time raiding too, don't forget. All right, the Magyar, who in a way replaced the Huns, they're similar to them, they're more nomadic people, they also invade. They're not as successful in the long run as the Muslims will be. All right, and of course the Vikings are going all over the place between the 700s to the early 1000s. Now, having said this, the Vikings don't leave much. Other than the Danelaw area in England, remember I mentioned those towns with Wick in their name, meaning they were Vikes or Viking trading posts, they don't leave a lot behind. They don't leave culture behind. They basically smash and grab. They take people, they take things, they love to invade the monasteries because it's easy pickings, and then they take their plunder and they go. All right. Mostly what they did for Europe was they forced them to move away from the coastlands and build better walls. All right, but they don't leave anything. The Muslims, especially in Spain, leave some culture behind as they're slowly at first moving forward and then being pushed back. All right, so just some things to think about. All right, the Vikings in the long run do not actually gain territory for very long, but they do create problems for the Europeans. All right. Now, having said this, they spend a lot of time raiding in Northern Europe and the Baltic. In fact, it's said that some Vikings sailed up into Russia, and it's believed that Russia, which means Rus or red in Norse, might be a byproduct of their arriving there. After all, the Swedish Vikings spent a lot of time working their way through Russia in conquest and trading. Remember, Vik can mean to trade or to raid. All right. Now, different Vikings went everywhere. Normandy, which is in France, and we'll play a part later when we talk about William the Conqueror, Normandy was settled by Vikings. There were a small contingent of Vikings. All right. Vikings went up the Volga River, which is now in Russia. All right. So they did make some inroads, but overall, they never established a new Scandinavian colony. They kind of became their own entities over time as they mingled with locals. All right. They were most successful in Ireland. Dublin would be part of this pattern that would be established. Of course, the Danelaw in England and Normandy. But again, they don't establish a, quote, Scandinavian state. All right, they only settle, mingle with the locals. Some of their customs are transmitted, but overall, they begin to take on the characteristics of wherever it is they've settled. Also, once they get Christianity and set aside their practice of worshiping Odin and Thor, they become more peaceful. But of course, that's going to be a while. All right, just some things to keep in mind. All right, and of course, they venture into Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, and it's said that they actually got to North America before Christopher Columbus, but unfortunately for them, the locals had bows and arrows, better range weapons, and Viking settlements in the so-called New World would not last long. A lot of them left, or they were the ones that stayed behind, tried to establish colonies, were killed by the locals. All right. And the Christianization of the Vikings, as I said, as this began to take root and spread, they began to start to think about staying home more or assimilating with the local population. One other interesting note about the Vikings. While the men were out, the women had their own councils back home. They ran their own farms. They were able to defend themselves against anybody who would come and try to take over for them. Now we believe, interestingly, when they checked a war chief's bones in one of the museums recently, it was discovered that he was actually a she. Now we don't know how many women Vikings there were, but we realize now that that egalitarian mindset might very well have also included trading and raiding in the Viking culture. Again, we're not entirely sure, but now there's going to be a check to make sure that nobody has missed anything. So it's an interesting time for Viking studies right now. You know, have to see how that plays out. All right, so going on. My apologies, I lost my place. There we go. All right, so when we turn to Europe as a whole, and we look at the power system, we look at the crisis, when the collapse of the Carolingian system happened, politics had to be rethought because now they're smaller, they're more fractured. But here's what tends to become the system in Europe. If you remember, we spoke of the latifundia during the Roman period. We spoke of all the slaves who were bound to the land, basically. We spoke about how when Rome fell, some of these latifundia basically lay almost abandoned and basically had to become their own little settlements. And the coloni, the slaves who had been left there, became in essence the first serfs. All right, vassalage is how this new system works. Remember I mentioned land is wealth? All right, who owns the land? Well, descendants of all these warlords that people rallied around. All right, in a way, they're kind of thugs. They were able, some of them were rather thuggish, some were more principled warriors, but regardless, they and their descendants now have established a hierarchy where people who can fight, the men who can fight, are protecting those who can't, and those who can are responsible for producing food to feed everyone. So vassalage, feudalism. The fief becomes the unit, if you will, of land, all right, the fief rather, the fief, all right, it's a right to use land or to get income from it, granted by the lord. Okay, the lord, the leader, has vassals, those who work under him, who swear loyalty to him, and they gain either protection or resources. And in return, they agree to pledge their military service. So you have your lord, maybe he has 3 vassals, and then under them are all the serfs, and the land is broken out into fiefs. So perhaps you pay the lord in military service and a percentage of produce from your land that your serfs are producing. All right. And subinfeudation, now there's a word you don't hear too often, right? Subinfeudation might be maybe a vassal is getting too old to go out in the field anymore. Maybe he really doesn't have much energy. So if he doesn't have sons who can take up the mantle for him, he might turn to others who he knows can fight very well. And what he may do is break out his fief into 3 parts, one for him, and then one each for these new people who are now going to go and fight in his stead for him. So he's still loyal to his lord and he's still providing the military service. He's just not going himself. Subinfeudation became very complicated, and it's probably one of the reasons why even now we have so many nobles and minor nobles throughout Europe, because all of these people in turn granted those to their descendants and the cycle continued. All right. The whole system depends, though, on honor, mutual obligations. So you owe your lord military service. You're going to give it to him either yourself or through your representatives. All right. Unfortunately, there's no central authority. Power is scattered throughout Europe in all these different fiefs owned by all these different lords who have all these different vassals working for them. It gets very, very complicated. All right. But the main way this works is vassals provided their lords with military service. All right. And of course, the lords own the land and the serfs, the peasants, worked for them. Now, the peasants were owned by the land, so the lord could change, but their situation would not change until the establishment of towns, which we'll talk about later. All right. So right now, though, you're kind of limited in your options. You're either a serf or a lord or a vassal. So pretty limited in terms of society, but it made people able to survive in a rather harsh environment. All right. Eventually, as new orders emerged and kings and dukes began to come out of this, eventually we will see monarchy restored. But for a long time, monarchy was pretty limited. All right. And unfortunately, you know, the new Frankish kings that did emerge from Charlemagne's descendants and others would have to spend their time and energy defeating the Magyars in order to establish control back over the area of northern Italy. In Europe, still a lot of fragmentation. Even when we look at France, it's only a tiny little sliver run by a king. All right, and Alfred the Great, who will go on to help unify the Anglo-Saxons, even he has a problem because he's got that Danelaw cutting across the island. All right, so even as Alfred the Great is fighting back the Vikings, and believe me, this is a battle that's going to go on for a very long time. All right, it's really difficult when you have basically a foreign nation in your own backyard. All right, so unfortunately, even as kings are emerging, their power still is somewhat circumscribed. All right. And when we turn from what used to be the western half of the empire and the farthest reaches of it, when we look at, for example, Roman Britain, which is now, of course, Britain proper, with the Anglo-Saxons, when we turn back to the East, which, if you recall, had all the money and all the power and all the trade, well, they've been getting whittled down because they have new people groups who have emerged. Remember, the Sasanian Persians were their big problem. The Persians had their own problems, and their attention was away from, the Sasanians' attention was away from Byzantium at this point in the Byzantine Empire. But new people groups are keeping them busy. All right, there are Islamic armies now. All right, because they want that rich prize of Constantinople. There's the Slavs, there's the Bulgars, there's all these different groups. So even though they have money and they have resources, they're losing territory. All right, so the medieval Byzantine Empire is a little worried right now. All right. And while they have luxury goods being brought from their ports to all around the area, and they're getting that money, they're having internal conflicts and external conflicts, which are, of course, greatly reducing their ability to function. All right. Reforms helped. All right. But there was a schism. We had talked about the split between the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. All right. And until the Macedonian dynasty emerges, it's a difficult time to be in the Byzantine Empire. All right. Remember Justinian and Theodora. I mean, they had really helped to create a strong empire, but unfortunately, problems emerged. Now, however, with this new Macedonian dynasty, they begin to retake some of the land. They begin to improve the land for those who were farming, because remember, without farmers, there's no food. And now the Byzantines are feeling pretty good about themselves. Unfortunately, they don't know that things are going to fall in the 1400s. But right now, things are good. All right. So during the 800s and the 900s, they begin to see gains. All right. They also cultivate all these new lucrative trade agreements with the West, which of course leads to that economic survival. They have a lot of luxury goods that they are now sending to these lords and more wealthy vassals across Europe. All right. And in fact, they are also starting to make inroads with Christianity into the Eastern European area, to the Slavs, to the Bulgars, to the Russians. All right. So suddenly they're starting to see their fortunes, if you will, on an upswing. All right. The Poles, the Czechs, and the Hungarians will, in time, become assimilated into the Catholic Church. So it's kind of a mirror image. On one side, you've got the Greek Orthodox converting the Russians and converting the Slavs. And then on the other side, you've got the Poles, the Czechs, and the Hungarians who are getting assimilated into the Catholic Church and the Latin culture. So more and more homogenization is taking place in the two regions. More and more people groups are beginning to enter into this Christian culture with its undertones of Romanness, although it's not Roman like it used to be. All right. And in fact, the Slavs will go on to found what we will later know as Russia. All right. So this is but the Byzantines a great time. All right. Again, the Slavs had some different sects of Christianity, but they do tend in the East to go more toward the Byzantine. The West tends to go more toward the Roman Catholic, which of course is understandable. Geographically speaking, this makes perfect sense. Now, Oleg, who was a Viking, had unified some of the Eastern Slavic territories under that new state of Russia, and they're living in Kiev. All right. So the Russians are not all of one piece. Some of them are more Viking, some of them are more Slavic. All right. But of course, all of this will eventually result in creating a distinct Russian culture. All right. I know I'm going a bit fast, but I just want to get you through the highlights again. This is what these videos are designed to do. All right. Now we need to turn our attention away from the Christian world for a bit, because there's things going on in the Muslim world. All right. Remember the Shiites and the Sunnis. The Sunnis say everything happened as Allah willed. The Shiites say, but we wanted Ali and his descendants. All right. I'm greatly simplifying this because I know to the people who are involved, there's probably a lot of finer points and a lot of nuance, but we're just looking at it from a historical lens. All right. We have the beginnings of the Islamic empires because of the split in doctrine. It also created political splits, created new political entities. We had the Abbasids, for example. Later, we'll have the Umayyads. We'll have all these different groups, all right? But when we look at the Abbasids, who overthrew the Umayyads, I'm sorry, I always flip those two in my mind. So the Abbasids overturn the Umayyads, and then later we'll have the Fatimids and a whole bunch of other different groups. All right, so the Abbasids established their kingdom. They established this new dynasty, and they start to expand, all right? 30 million people will be under their rule. This is a big player, all right? they're moving their capital. They move it to Baghdad. All right. And at some point, they move it again. During their highest point, they're going to move it to Medina. You might remember Medina. It was where Muhammad went to become a judge and an arbiter after he left Mecca. All right. So they're an extremely cosmopolitan group. Just to give you perspective, while Europe is still trying to remember things that were lost, you know, they did bathe. They did practice some basic hygiene, although it depends on where you were and when you were in the medieval period. At its height, the Islamic Empire will be performing eye surgery and removing cataracts with a needle and some opioids. So they would be able to get people to see again. They'd be able to remove the cataract. All right. These are very sophisticated people, and they are very cosmopolitan. All right. And they are very open to talking to other groups. They establish centers of learning, much like the university in Europe. All right. So these are people who are building large public buildings because they haven't lost all the ancient knowledge. They still remember the arch. They still remember how to build more complicated architectural structures. They have massive libraries that come into existence because they want to contain the knowledge and they want to understand and they want to use it. So they have all the old pagan texts, you know, what the Christian world would consider pagan texts. They have Plato, they have Aristotle, they have Socrates. They have a large range from the ancient Roman and Greek civilization. And in fact, except for the copies that were preserved and copied over and over again by the monks, a lot of that knowledge was either lost or living in a monastery just waiting to be rediscovered in the West. All right. So the Abbasids really are a very sophisticated culture. Very, very sophisticated. All right. Just something to keep in mind. All right. Their empire was somewhat decentralized, though not to the point of the West with all the feudalism and the manorialism. All right. And unfortunately, though, they found themselves having issues. In 711, the Umayyad refugees come to the Spanish area, to the Al-Andalus region, and establish Cordoba. Still has a wonderful mosque you can see today. All the arches are red and white striped. And in fact, they will establish an Islamic culture there. A lot of the things today in Spain, such as the citrus trees, were brought by the Umayyads and cultivated. Silkworm production would also start up in Spain because of the Umayyads. So again, the Islamic world is divided. All right. So you have the Umayyads who have now established a foothold in Spain, and the Abbasids who are living in what used to be Persia, all right, which is now today modern day Iran and Iraq. All right. And they are, of course, bringing with them their culture, their knowledge. All right. So this is a very interesting time for Islam. But here's the difference. In Spain, they're looking to absorb the traditions and the knowledge of the local cultures under their rule. All right. They're also looking for more classical texts. The Europeans, they don't know about these. They've largely disappeared. All right. Some of the Islamic culture breakthroughs will include algebra, medical encyclopedia. All right. That will later become a key source for European medicine, because remember how much knowledge had been lost, Galen and Hippocrates and a number of other sources. I mean, Galen was being used, but it wasn't always being understood. And depending on the version you had, you may or may not have the whole thing. All right. And in addition, depending on where you were, there was a division between Islamic people and Christian people, and they valued the Christians and the Jews and called them the people of the book, but a lot of times the differing things were, if you were a believer, you weren't taxed. If you were a believer, if you were not a believer, you were taxed. If you were a believer, you weren't. You didn't have to pay the taxes. And some became Islamic simply to avoid paying taxes. Others became because they truly believed. But regardless, there was an exchange of knowledge between the Muslim and the non-Muslim world. All right. And in fact, the Abbasids would make it a point to break down the distinction between the Arab and the non-Arab Muslims, because they wanted to have them come together under the banner of Islam rather than their native areas. All right. And again, the Islamic world really began to add to knowledge during this time period. Europe, unfortunately, was still, I hate to say it, kind of in that dark age. It wasn't as dark as we think, but it was still darker than we would have liked, all right? I know we've gone over this rather quickly, but again, I'm just trying to give you the overview. I'm just trying to help you to understand the highlights, because there's a lot to take in, and I'm just really trying to give you chapter to chapter, quiz to quiz, what I really feel every educated person should know about history, so that you have a nice background to use for other studies. All right, so here we are. Charlemagne getting crowned. Big moment for Europe. Big moment. All right. Charlemagne's territory. Again, not the size of the Roman Empire at its height, but still very, very nice. The equestrian statue of Charlemagne, although some claim it might be Charles the Bold rather than Charlemagne, this sets a precedent, because as land equals wealth, horses equal power. A lot of your governing heads of state and your nobles are going to start to show themselves portrayed on horseback, because the idea was nobles rode stallions, male horses who, unlike geldings, had not been fixed or castrated, and therefore the ability to control a powerful male animal was seen as an extension, if you will, of the king's power, the noble's power over men and women in general. So throughout a lot of the art between the medieval and the early modern period, there's an emphasis on horse-related art. And of course, manuscripts. Without the monks, Western civilization would have had a lot of difficulty. It took about 40 sheep to make a Bible, because you had to cure their hides and create parchment. And if you wanted vellum, which was finer yet, you needed to kill calves, baby cows, in order to have finer parchment. But having said that, it was preserving knowledge. It took longer for parchment to disintegrate than paper, although paper, some books from the early period with the beginning of the printing press have held up very, very well. And of course, it was thicker paper than what we think of today. But at the same time, parchment did fade and it did wear. And a lot of the inks they used could actually, over time, because they were so acidic, eat holes into the parchment. So monks had to keep copying over and over again. Fun fact, today they joke when you graduate, you get your sheepskin. Well, once upon a time, when you graduated from the universities of Europe, your diploma was indeed on sheepskin, parchment. So this was how we preserve knowledge over time, was all these monks copying these books over and over and over again. All right, and of course, during this time period, medical science wasn't what it used to be. They used to use leeches, and they would cut you and bleed you in order, because it was believed it would balance your humors. Whether you were melancholy or sanguine or what have you, you would need to have your blood put back into balance. All right, as you can see, after Charlemagne's death and the Treaty of Verdun, we have 3 new entities. And of course, this shatters this idea of a Holy Roman Empire being united, and of course, fragments Europe further for quite some time. All right, and of course, here's a Bible copied. Books were given to and from various heads of state. It was seen as a status symbol. They were very expensive to make. Monks would make them. It could take years. All right. And as you can see, a lot of activity going on between the Vikings, Magyars, and the Muslims as they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, trying to establish new kingdoms, new areas. Or in the case of Vikings, a lot of times they were just basically doing smash and grabs and going home. All right, until they started to settle certain areas. All right. So as you can see, there's a lot of movement during this time period. All right, and in fact, there's a new Viking museum, I believe. I want to say in Norway or Denmark. But if you want to check, there's some ship burials as well. Sutton Hoo in England, for example, is a lovely example of this, and they have a museum. I believe there are some pictures available online if you're interested in seeing more. As you can see, these boats are very, very sleek. And this was actually important because if you look closely, the hull isn't very wide. It isn't very deep. This enabled Vikings to get very far up rivers. They'd beach them, they'd go do their smash and grab, they'd run back, they'd get back on the boat, and they'd be gone. And these ships were built for speed. So they are deceptively simple looking, and yet they are great examples of engineering. All right, and of course, a knight would indeed get a piece of land from his lord, providing for his economic support, because remember, he's a vassal providing military service to his lord. Now, knight comes from the Old English knicht, Knicht. All right, and that's how we get the word knight, knicht. All right, again, this is a chivalric culture. This is a chevalier-driven culture. Cheval means horse. Horses drove a lot of this time period's powerful people. You could say it's an era of horsepower, although not in the same way we think of today. All right. And as you can see, this is an example of what a manorial system or a manor might have looked like. It's kind of a descendant of the Latifundia from the ancient Roman world. All right. And of course, you would go to the village to meet your blacksmith or to have a tool mended if you needed. And you would have different fields and different crops would be rotated. As you can see, this is a fallow field that's at rest. You might have remembered I mentioned that term earlier. You would probably be growing a lot of wheat or beans. Wheat takes from the land, beans give it back. You might be growing other crops that would put nutrients back into the land. Wheat was pretty hard on the land, so you rotated your crops. Plots for peasants, they would grow their own vegetables, their own food as a surplus to help out. All right, and in fact, peasants did a lot of the back-breaking work. There wasn't a whole lot of free time as a peasant. All right, again, Byzantine Empire, as you can see, it's begun shrinking. Persia has gotten a little bit bigger. They've lost some territory. If you remember, Justinian really tried to push for the reunification. Didn't last long. All right, and as you can see, a lot of the Slavs break into different groups and they travel all over looking for new opportunities. The Abbasids reach a pretty big area for some time. Of course, remember, they explode out of the Arabian Peninsula, right? Muhammad, Mecca, later Medina. Medina will be the capital for some time. All right, they will also, of course, have Baghdad. So, pretty good size. Now, notice Fatimid Egypt. All right, so Egypt was taken over by the Fatimids, who I always find interesting. Apparently, were named for Fatima, his daughter, Muhammad's daughter. All right, and of course, the Greek philosophers were lost to Europe for a long time. Had it not been for the Muslims keeping that alive, we might not have all the texts we have now. All right, and here's your timeline. All right, I know I went a little fast. Again, if you need them, there are slides, without my narration in the document and resource tab. I will be holding office hours again on Tuesday and Thursday, as I always do, so please stop on by, email me with any questions you might have, and I hope I see you soon, all right? So in the meantime, I hope you have a great week and everything goes well, and I guess that's it for now. All right. So again, if you need anything, please reach out. All right. Have a great week. Bye.